morning, everyone. Um, as promised, let's go over the walkthrough of how you would write your Python script uh, based on uh, using Cisco DNA Center, or in this case, our packet tracer with the SDN controller. The assumption here is that your packet tracer is set up, your devices are added to your topology, and everything is connected. Again, I am not going to walk through that part of it. The assumption here is that you have already done that, and we are just going to go through the setup of how you would write your Python script from start to finish. All right. So to start off, let's look at what you would do in order to set up your environment. Um, the assumption here is we are talking about this from the perspective that this is a new project you are starting. So we are going to walk through the entire setup from start to finish. So first things first, I am going to cd into my development folder, and if you remember, I said that everything I work on is inside of the development folder. So and if we do a ls, it would show you everything that I'm working on, but we don't want to do that. So first thing we want to do therefore is make a directory, and we are going to call it another DNAC. And the reason why I'm calling it another is because I sent you the sample code for what we did previously, and it was called DNAC walkthrough. Well, so this one is being called another DNAC, and that directory gets created. What we do therefore at this point is cd into another DNAC, and if you do a ls in there, there is nothing. That folder is blank. So first thing we want to do is to create our Python environment. So we're going to do python 3-m venv dot, and the dot basically is saying we need to create that virtual environment right here. And if we hit enter and we wait a few seconds, it gets created. We know it's created by doing ls, and you can see that it has created the bin folder and all these associated folders. So, and we can go ahead and activate our virtual environment by doing source bin activate, and we know that it's activated because on this far side that name has changed from base to another DNAC. For you guys, it would be that in parentheses or brackets or whatever you want to call those. Now, at this point, the next thing we want to do is to go to GitHub and create our repository. So we are going to go to GitHub. So we're going to go to github.com, and on GitHub, what we want to do is we want to create a new repository. And if you already know this, we're going to call it another DNAC. And we know it's good because GitHub tells us so, it's available. And we want to give it a description. So we are going to say something to the effect of, this is another walk through of how we would set up our Python project for Cisco DNAC. I mean, you could type whatever you want in there. Leave the access to public, and then click on add readme file. And that is pretty much it. And then of course we are going to hit create repository. that tells us that it's complete, and next thing we want to do is get the code for that. And so we are going to do that. Click on code and then hit the clipboard to copy that code. We are going to take that code and go back into our whatever they call it, into our terminal to clone this repository. Okay, so back here we are back in our Ubuntu folder, and we want to verify where we are. So we are going to do pwd, and it tells me that I am inside my DNAC folder, or my another DNAC folder. So what we want to do is do git clone, and then I'm going to just paste the stuff that we got from GitHub, which is another DNAC.git, and then hit enter, and we get cloned. And we would know it's there by doing ls, and you can actually see that we have now a folder in here called another DNAC. So we are going to cd into another DNAC, and it tells you that everything looks good because it just got cloned. If we do a ls, we should see that readme file, cat readme, and you can see that this is another walkthrough. It's basically the description that I put in there. But we now have a working directory inside of our another DNAC folder. I mean, they basically have the same name. So the first thing we want to do at this point now is to do touch, and we do main.py. Our main.py is the file that we are going to use to run our Python code. This file, you could call it anything as long as it ends with a .py extension. You could call it monkey.py, goats.py, fish.py. Heck, you could call it ba.py. That's your prerogative. But that creates that, and we know it's there because if we do ls, there are now two files in there, readme.py and readme.md and main.py. So to now edit this file, we are going to do code, and then you could just call the file name, so main.py. But I don't actually like doing that. I just do code and I open it in the entire folder, and so it will be code, and then I put a dot, and that will open Visual Studio. So let's go ahead and switch to that. Okay, so now that we are inside of Visual Studio, to the left side you would see that our main.py is right here and our readme.md is right here. So if we just click on the main.py, then you would be able to directly edit that file, right? So what exactly do we want to do now? We want to start working on our Python file, and to make this easier, we are going to cheat a little bit. But before we do that, the first thing you want to do is create a doc string explaining what it is that your script does. So the first thing we want to do is we do that, and basically we are going to explain what our script does to other people. We want to explain what our script does to other people. And so here, all I do is get rid of this word that says summary, and then I'm going to say script to create a token and get the devices that are deployed in our SDN controller on packet tracer. Now you can make this as explicit as you want. You can write a lot. The whole idea is make sure that your whatever you are writing explains your script, and therefore when someone else is looking at that code, they can figure out what it is that you were trying to do or say. Now let's get to the part where I said we could cheat a little bit. Okay, so we have right here the API call that we already made, which generated our token. We have that already, and we know that it works. So at this point, what you want to do is, I'm just going to come here to this to the code or to the API call that we did called DNAC first, and I'm going to right click on it, and then I'm going to select generate code. That basically would generate the code that is required to run that to make that call, right? And if you notice, it says here at the top that it's using Python and request. If yours doesn't say that, you would need to use these carrots to drop it down and set it to Python and then request. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the entire code, right? Including all the way to the top. And then right click and select copy, or you can just do Control C. Or you could just also hit copy to clipboard right here. And it says copy. So once we have our code copied, we are going to come back to Visual Studio, and we are just going to paste that code right in there. And that is pretty much it. We can actually run this. But if you remember, I told you guys that I don't particularly enjoy writing procedural code where the code just starts running from the top to the bottom. I actually prefer writing functional code, and that is because it modularizes the code such that if something breaks, I only have to fix that one module. I don't actually have to figure out fixing the entire code. I fix only the part that needs fixing without changing anything else, and the code is going to start working continuously without messing with everything else. So because of that approach, we would need to actually modify this code so that it becomes a Python function as opposed to just being being in this procedural style in which it's set up currently. Now, but before we do that, there are a few things that we also need. If you remember, I told you guys that when we run scripts, sometimes we are not there when the script is running. So we want that script to be, the output from that script to be saved somewhere. So you would actually need to add a few things. So for example, you would need to add the logging module, which would allow you to log the output from your scripts to a file. Again, I'm not going to show you how to set up logging. You can actually Google that, but you would actually need to import it. We would also need to have, let's say, the datetime module, because if we want to use time stamping in our logging, then we would need some way to tell the system what date and time it is. So you would import the datetime module. if we intend to use any system modules, we would also need to import the uh, system module, so import sys, and sometimes you would need to import the OS if you needed to make any OS level changes to your scripts. Now, that covers our imports, but let's say we have that. Now, how do we turn this whole thing into a function? So you would define a new function, and we would say dev get token, because that's the module we copied. And because we want to be able to reuse this script on different servers, we would need some way to change the IP addresses for those servers and the port numbers. So we cannot leave this thing to be static the way it is. We need some way to change that. So we need some way to be able to pass that in. So we want to say that we would pass in the host, and then the port, the username, and the password, with the assumption here being that these are all variables that were already defined in the snippet that we copied. We just don't, and it's not even best practice to have your username and your password sitting inside the script, because if I push this to GitHub, then everyone would know what the password is. So once we have that, what we want to do at this point is need a column right there. We are going to have to modify this script so that it's generic enough where I can run it on any number of servers, or on a number of SDN controllers with very little modification, i.e. the username and the password get passed in automatically, right? So first thing we want to do is we want to change a few things here, and we are going to change this local host to be the host. We want the port number to be the port, and the reason why we are doing that is to make it as generic as possible. We want the username, or my username, to be username, and of course we want the password to be the user's password. So any user should be able to run this without with their own credentials, right? So we have now changed all of that, but the problem here is that this user, while we have changed it, there is no way for the system to know what those values are without you asking, unless you ask, unless you get them from the user. Oh, and by the way, because this is a function, we would want to indent. We would want to indent that, and so if you're using VS Code, once you highlight that, it's Control and then the left brace. Now, best practice also says that you need to put in some documentation or a doc string for your function to let people know what it does. So I'm going to say third one. and then basically you would have to fill in this. So the description is gets a token from the SDN controller for use later. But you can pretty much write whatever you feel like. Now, because I am using Visual Studio Code, I have an extension that generates all of these boilerplate code, which you would need to actually, if you were using that, you would need to define it. You would need to define each one of these variables. That way, when someone else is looking at your code, they would know what each of these variables does, and that way they know what to do with it. I mean, you want to be very explicit in your documentation such that everything is peachy, right? Now that we have that defined, we still haven't defined the username, the password, the host, and all that stuff. So the way we would do that would be to create a few functions where we could say define def get username and password, and we have just created a function. Now we need to do what that function does. So we are going to say username equals input. What is your username? Right? Now, because we are going to ask the user for their password, but we don't want someone standing behind them to see them type that password in, we also need to import another module called import get pass. This module allows us to get a password from the user without the need to without someone standing behind them being able to see their password. So if they were typing the password, all the person standing behind them would see a blank screen, just a blank line, no matter what they type. So now we are going to use get pass to get the password from the user. So what we do here is we're going to say password equals get pass dot get pass, and then we're going to say please enter your password, and that is pretty much it. And then we are going to say return username comma password. That way we are going to use that later, but we are creating this so generically that it works for getting the username and the password from the user. And of course you would need your doc string, so 3 and then of course you would enter the description or enter the summary of what it does. So here I'm just going to say gets a username and password from the user, and that's pretty much it. We also need the host name and the port number for the DNAC or the SDN controller we want to connect to. So the way we do that would be to define a new function if you remember, I said all of my functions do one thing and one thing only. So, which is why we are segmenting all of that. So we're going to do def get host and port. And then we are going to say host equals input. Please enter the IP or host name of the DNAC or SDN controller. And then we are going to also say port equals input. Please enter the port number for the controller. And then we are going to return host and port. And of course we do need our description. Gets the host and port number from the user. And that is pretty much it. But there is also that other thing where there's the other stuff that we wrote to get all the devices. So for that, we are going to go back to our Insomnia to copy some more code that is going to assist us in writing less code. But I mean, we are just cheating a little bit. Okay, so we are now back to our to Insomnia. All we have to do at this point is go here to the code that we wrote to get all the devices that are configured in our DNAC or SDN controller. So all we do is the same thing. Right click. We are going to right click, and then we are going to select generate code, and the code is here. But the one thing you want to notice is that the import request is already there. We don't need to import it twice. So we can just copy this part all the way to just before the import request. We don't need that anymore. And then we are going to copy this. And then we are going to go back to our Visual Studio, and then we are going to paste that in there. Okay, so now that we have we are back to our Visual Studio, and we have just copied some new code. What we need to do with that is come here to the bottom, and we are going to paste that, Control V. But again, if you notice, this is not inside of a function, so we need to actually modify this code to be like the rest of them, so that we can have it be functional. So all we are going to do here is define a new function, def get network devices, and if you remember, what I said earlier was that the only time you would use your username and password for the SDN controller is when you need to get that token. For every subsequent request, we need to use the API key that was gotten the first time. So for that, we would need to pass that key in. So I'm going to type in here API key because that's the one value that is needed for every subsequent request from that is made to the SDN controller. And additionally, we also need to pass in the the local host or the host, the port number, because those things are necessary, as you would see here in this URL of what is used to make the call to the controller. So first things first, we want to therefore change this thing so we can use it with multiple devices or multiple instances. And so the way we do that is make that into host, and then make that an F string. Set this to the port, and then set that to port. And that is pretty much it. Now, also we need to correct remove the token from the script. The reason here being, you don't want other people to know what the token is when you push your code to GitHub or wherever. So we're going to get rid of that, and then we are going to make it a variable and call it API key. That is best practice. You don't want the key to ever be inside of the code. As a matter of fact, we do have software that scans code that you write looking for stuff like that, and you don't want to be caught being the one person who is writing code and leaving your security tokens inside the code. You want this whole thing to be on the fly. So what are we going to do now? Well, if you remember, the code that we wrote to get the API key returns more than just the API key. We need some way of removing just the key from within everything that is returned, which is what we are going to look at next. So before we do that, there's one thing that we need to do first. And in this case, we need to improve on our Python interpreter. So before we work on getting just that API token, we need to install something. So we are going to go back to our Ubuntu, and here we are going to do pip install, and we are going to install IPython. And IPython has now been installed, but it says that I am using an older version of pip, so I'm just going to upgrade it here by doing pip install -- upgrade pip, and pip has now been installed correctly. And if we do pip list, we should now have the correct version of pip, the most updated version. So we now know that the script, or we have all the requirements for what we need to do. So to test out our script, or to test out to work on getting just the API key from the output from your first API call, we are going to go back to Insomnia, go to the first API call, and then just copy all of the stuff. I'm not going to show that, but you're going to copy everything that was in the output. That was in the output when you made the API call, including the key. And we are going to copy that, and then we are going to come back with that to our Ubuntu terminal. Here, I'm going to type IPython to create an IPython terminal, an interpreter. And basically what we want to do is we want to define a variable which we call response, because that's what our script is doing. And then we are going to paste the stuff that we copied from within the terminal inside of that. And if you notice, the response is a set of key value pairs, right? So if I hit enter, that has now generated that variable. And in fact, if we call it, we get to see the same set of the same output. Now, in this whole output, we are only interested in this section right here, the API key, nothing else. We don't need the idle timeout. We don't need the session timeout. We don't need the version, right? So how do we do that? This is technically a dictionary. So the way you would read a dictionary would be to just call the variable and then use a pair of square brackets to get the values that are the keys that are generally on the left side to respond and provide what's the value on the right. So in this case, what we are looking for is 3 layers deep, right? So what we would do is we would say response square bracket inverted comma open, and we are going to say response, which is this first one here, this one, response, and I'm just going to tab to it. That's the beauty of using VS Code. Of using IPython. We close our square bracket, open another square bracket, another inverted comma open, and we are going to, what we need here is this service ticket. That's what we need. And we're just going to copy that, paste it in there, and voila, and that's it. And if I hit enter, you'll see that it returns only the API key. It doesn't return anything else. So why is that important? It's important because we need it to get just that. So we are going to copy this string here, and we are going to take that to our Visual Studio code and use it inside of our code. So now we are back to our Visual Studio code. We do know that we need only the API key, but here our response was printing the whole thing. So all we need to do at that point is get rid of this line, because we don't want it to print the whole thing. We just want only the API key. We are just going to delete that whole thing. And then we are going to Control V and paste the stuff that we are going to paste the stuff that we got from our IPython. And then we are just going to make that a return statement. So return response response.service ticket, and that should return only the API key, which is what we actually need. Now that would bring us back to our code. That would bring us back to our code, And we would notice that we need to correct this by moving everything inland. And we'll do that by controlling control and I don't know why I did that. It will be control and square bracket. That would move that in. And of course we want to put a description here as to what our code is doing, and then we would say get a list of devices that are defined in our DNAC. And then you can fill the rest of them. But that is only half of the battle. So now that we have that, the one thing that is actually left is that we have defined all of these things, all of these functions, but we have not called them. It's actually pointless to define functions without calling them. So the approach, or the way we would do it, would be to now define a new function, and we are going to call this function main. And I just noticed that my indentation here is wrong. Okay, now it's correct. We don't want to have problems. So we are going to define a new function, and we're going to call it main. And basically main will call all of these functions such that this is us putting everything back together. If you remember when I said that you modularize your code, you basically take the problem, you break it up into smaller pieces, and then you put those pieces back together to solve the problem. That is what we are doing here. So first we got the username and password, then we got the host and the port, then we got a token, which is what we want to use, and then we get the network devices, which is ultimately what we want to end up with. So we have defined main, and then we are going to now do the first thing we want to do, which is get the username and the password from the user. So we are going to say that username password is equals to get username and password. Now, the reason why I do it that way, if you notice here, it says return username, password. It's the same thing down here. Username, password. So it basically takes those two values which come in as a tuple and it splits them into individual username, into individual values. Right? Next thing is host port equals get host and port, and again it's the same. In our function definition, we know that it returns the host and the port, so we are just calling them host and port, and we get that, and whatever it returns will be assigned to these two variables, right? And then we want to get the API token, which is the next thing, right? And the get token requires the host, the port, the username, and the password. So we are going to now use these things that we have created. We are going to say token equals get what was it? What's the function? Get token. Get token, and then we are going to pass in the host, the port, the username, and the password. That allows us to get the token. Then, once we have the token, we know that it's going to, whatever it returns will be assigned to the word token. And then finally, we are going to do our get network devices. And then we are going to pass in the API key, the host, and the port. So for that one, we are just going to do get network devices. And if you notice, I am not assigning it to a value because I know it's just printing it. And then we are going to say here that token, and then host, and then port. And that is pretty much it for that function. Now, that in itself is not the interesting part. So one thing you still always need to do is to say if name is equal to main, then do something. In this case, we want to make it run main. And that is pretty much it for the run through. Now, if you try to run this code at this point, it's going to fail. The reason why it's going to fail is because this module request is not yet installed. So let's go back to our Ubuntu terminal, and then we are going to install that. Okay, so back on our Ubuntu terminal, we just want to, I don't actually even need to get out of this. I can just do clear. I am going to install request. Now, the way to run a command inside of IPython without exiting is to use the exclamation point, pip install requests. That we know that it's installed. We would do exclamation pip list. And the reason why you are doing exclamation is because what you don't want IPython to assume that you are trying to run an IPython command. The exclamation is telling it that we are trying to run a system command outside of IPython, but inside IPython. And if you notice, we have our request module has been installed. And just to verify that it's installed, if I do import request, there are no errors. So that tells me that it's installed. We also need to verify. We can also do import get pass. It doesn't error out, so we know that our IPython, our request is installed, our get pass is installed, and everything is good to go. Now, what is left here is to run the script. Now, the script is going to error out again because I am using the Windows subsystem for Linux version 2, which doesn't allow you to interface with the local host the local host on your DNAC or your SDN controller. But for you guys, it should work. And again, I already posted the companion script for this in GitHub. You can just go clone it from there and use that. But to verify that it works, while we are here, we can test it. So we can, at least the first part of it is going to work. So we are going to say Python 3-m, Python 3 or Python, and then we are going to say main.py. And it's asking for my username, which in this case is that. And the password is that. And then it wants the host IP address or the host name for the controller. In this case, it's localhost. And it wants the port number. And in our case, it was 58,000. But like I said, it's not going to work for me because I am using Visual Studio, the Windows Subsystem for Linux version 2. But for you guys, it should work because you are using the Windows Subsystem for Linux version 1. Now, if you do have any questions, hit me up on the Slack channel, because it would be folly to assume that in 1 3-week class you are able to fully articulate Python and be able to start using the REST APIs. Secondly, Tiny offered to help because he understands these things as well. So if you cannot reach me, hit Tiny up. Now I do hope that this has been informative for you. If it has, give it a like, share, subscribe. And again, I'm kidding with the like, share, subscribe thing, but you get the drift. All right. It was a pleasure having you all in the class. Doses.